Good morning or good evening, depending on which side of the world you're tuning in today. My name is Lisa Curtis, and I'm the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program here at the Center for a New American Security. We are delighted to be here today to launch a new report by the Task Force on the U.S.-Philippines Alliance. Over a year ago, this task force, which is made up over 20 experts, was formed and met 4 times in 2021. The purpose was to evaluate how we can strengthen this important bilateral alliance and make it more sustainable and resilient, especially in this era of increased U.S.-China competition. Several members of the task force traveled to the Philippines in March, and we were on a listening tour to hear from government officials, retired diplomats, the military, members of the business community, politicians, journalists, and others, to hear their views on the U.S.-Philippines relationship. We spent a week in the country. We visited Manila, Clark, Subic Bay, Caesar Basa Air Base, which is a EDCA facility, Marawi, where there was an ISIS uprising in 2017, and Butuan. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all members of the task force, most of whom signed on to the report and are listed on the cover page of the report. And I would especially like to thank my CNAS colleague, Associate Fellow for the Indo-Pacific, Mr. Josh Fitt, who is the principal co-author of the report and without whose hard work and dedication, this project would have not been possible. So we think this is an excellent time to release the report following the May 9th presidential election, which brought to power Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Our report notes that the U.S.-Philippines relationship suffered to some degree under the previous Duterte regime. Some of Duterte's policies tested the U.S.-Philippines alliance, such as his controversial counter-narcotics campaign, suspension of the Visiting Forces Agreement, and attempted realignment toward China. However, the turbulence also underscored the need for Washington to reprioritize this important alliance and lay out an affirmative agenda for the future. So in this report, we acknowledge the importance of the security relationship and the need to upgrade the political-military dialogue. We recommend the establishment of a new 2+2 dialogue between our defense and diplomatic leaders. We also recommend strengthening and being more explicit about our alliance commitments, given the new realities, such as China's gray zone activities, which seek to assert its expansive maritime claims. But we don't just focus on security in our recommendations. We also look at economics, health security, energy issues, and even legacy issues from our complicated colonial past. So here to talk about these issues, we have a stellar panel, all members of the task force and important contributors to the final report. We have with us today Dr. Patrick Cronin. He is the Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, where he researches the challenges and opportunities confronting the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Cronin was previously Senior Advisor and Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, my predecessor who left shoes way too big for me to fill. And before that, he was Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, where he simultaneously oversaw the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. In 2001, Dr. Cronin was confirmed by the United States Senate to the third-ranking position at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He also led the interagency task force that helped design the Millennium Challenge Corporation. We also have with us Dr. Satu Limaye. He is the Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he has created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative, and he is the founding editor of the Asia-Pacific Bulletin. He is also Senior Advisor at the Center for Naval Analyses. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and received his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a George C. Marshall Scholar. Third, we have Mr. Brian Harding. Mr. Harding joined the United States Institute of Peace in May 2020 as a senior expert on Southeast Asia. He has more than 15 years of experience in Southeast Asian affairs in government think tanks and in the private sector. He was previously Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and served as Director for East and Southeast Asia Policy at the Center for American Progress. From 2009 to 2013, Mr. Harding served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Country Director for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. So we were to have a fourth panelist. We were supposed to have a fourth panelist, Ambassador Harry Harris, who was, of course, ambassador in South Korea, as well as commander of Pacific Command. However, he was unable to join us, but he was kind enough to send in some responses to questions that I had posed. So I would first like to read his answers to two of my questions, which were, where do you see the greatest opportunities for strengthening this critical alliance to meet U.S. Indo-Pacific goals? Second, I asked him, how would you grade the Biden administration's approach toward managing the alliance? And here is what Ambassador Harris had to say. Our alliance with the Philippines is important not only for the U.S., but also for the Philippines and for the region. Our relationship suffered under the previous Philippine administration. But now we have a tremendous opportunity to reset and move forward. We have only 5 bilateral defense treaties in the entire world, and our alliance with the Philippines is one of these 5. We also have a checkered history with the Philippines across the entirety of the last century and into the 21st century. It's important that the U.S. acknowledges this history while looking ahead as equals. It's important that the U.S. That in doing so, the opportunities are vast. And these include enabling the armed forces of the Philippines to develop into a military force capable of defending the Philippines against external aggression, assisting the government of the Philippines to destroy terrorist groups, including those with deep ties to ISIS, developing forward operating sites that benefit both the armed forces of the Philippines and U.S. forces, and 4, infusing the Philippines with economic support to weaken the PRC's intent to pull Manila away from the U.S. and toward Beijing. Ambassador Harris says he'd give President Biden an A for formally acknowledging that the alliance is a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, for underscoring the primacy of the Indo-Pacific region to America's future. Third, for developing and then advocating for the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Indo-Pacific economic framework. And lastly, for deciding to name a future U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Telesforo Trinidad, honoring the only Filipino to receive the Medal of Honor. So with that, I would like to turn to Dr. Cronin and look a little bit more at how we might see the new government's foreign policy, particularly with regard to China. So President-elect Marcos Jr. has said the way forward with China is to expand our relationship, not only diplomatically, not only in trade, but also in culture, education, knowledge, health, and to address whatever minor disagreements we have right now. More recently, the president-elect told a group of reporters that he would use the 2016 UN tribunal ruling negating China's 9-line claims to assert the Philippines' territorial right against Beijing's expansive claims in the South China Sea. So how do you see the newly elected president pursuing ties to China? What factors will he consider as he manages the Philippines' relationship with China?
Well, Lisa, thank you for this opportunity. And before I sort of start to embroider well beyond the task force report, which was an outstanding task force that you put together, everybody deserves kudos, I think, for a great product. And I would second everything that Ambassador Harry Harris has written and you've just read. In thinking about the China relationship for President-elect Marcos, I think clearly economics, though, will be supreme, even though he talks about education and culture and in dealing with other issues. This is Philippines' largest trading partner. They're doing more than $5 billion a month of two-way trade rather easily, and that's been growing over the years. And it's going to be essential for a president in Manila who is trying to navigate the many dangerous shoals here of the pandemic, the war fallout, high inflation, the energy crunch, in dealing with the debt that the Philippines has incurred, especially during the pandemic. I think President-elect Marcos wants first and foremost to expand the wealth of the Philippines. He sees himself as sort of leading over the next 6 years a new golden era for the Philippines. He's just appointed a very friendly, business-friendly cabinet, which is a good sign. This is a welcome sign. And he's talked about shifting relations with China into high gear. So even though they've been growing, he's talking about a new gear of ratcheting up the relationship. But he is also, I think, very wary of the fact that Xi Jinping wants to lure the Philippines deeper into the orbit, as Ambassador Harris pointed out. And I think there's a real difference here between what Beijing says and what it does. And I think that's not lost on President-elect Marcos. You know, the congratulatory note that Xi Jinping sent right away after the election earlier in May talked about good neighborliness. And yet, what exactly does China mean by an independent foreign policy? Not the same thing that President-elect Marcos means. I mean, for President-elect Marcos, an independent foreign policy is very straightforward. It's kind of a free agency for the Philippines. It's strategic autonomy. But for Beijing, it's really a warning not to misalign, not to align against China's interests. So, you know, Xi can talk about partners through thick and thin, as he put it. But the reality is, who's controlling the hydrocarbons and the fish in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, where it overlaps with that 9-dash line? It's China, and Marcos knows that. So he inherits this longstanding but dynamic need to balance the economic partnership with China that he wants to grow with the security relationship with the United States, which he knows is essential to being a counterweight to China, even if he doesn't want to use that word as counterbalance and counterweight. The reality is he knows that the best way to engage China economically and otherwise is to make sure you've got a strong alliance with the United States. So that's how I think he will approach the China issue, Lisa.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was a very comprehensive response, and you talked a lot about economic issues. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit and turn to Dr. Limaye. The White House released a detailed framework, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, last week, May 23rd, which laid out 4 key pillars of economic engagement for the United States and the region: fair trade, including digital trade, supply chains, clean energy and infrastructure, and taxes and anti-corruption. So far, 14 countries, I think Fiji just joined, 14 countries have signed up to the framework, including the Philippines. So do you think that the IPF will impact U.S. economic engagement in a substantial way, particularly in the Philippines? And do you think the IPF will be effective, specifically in competing with China's Belt and Road initiatives in the Philippines? I think you're on mute.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Lisa, for the question and opportunity to participate. Congratulations to CNAS on the report, and fellow colleagues, great to see you. Look, on the economic front, IPEF has just been announced, as you all know, so it's quite new, and the 4 pillars have a number of elements, and exact negotiating protocols are to be worked out. But I think there are 3 or 4 big points I would make. One is the U.S.-Philippine relationship. Here we are in the 75th anniversary of the U.S.-Philippine relationship, post-independence relationship, is a fairly robust economic relationship. There's about $25 billion worth of trade. Philippines runs a trade surplus with us. There's investment going both ways. There's a significant amount of tourism and remittances that flow between our 2 countries. So there's a lot of engagement, commercial and economic engagement. So IPEF is not starting on a clean slate, but has an opportunity to build on an already existing set of commercial and economic relationships. The second point I'd make is the Philippines is already signed up for IPEF. Even in the first press conference, President-elect Marcos has made the point that they are involved in those negotiations. Exactly how they dock on to each of the elements of the pillar remains to be seen, not only for the Philippines, but I think all the countries, the 14, including, as you mentioned, Fiji just indicating it wanted to join. The point I'd make is it's not clear yet which pillars and which elements of those pillars Philippines will join. From what statements that officials in the Philippines have made, including the meeting between the Secretary of Commerce there in the Philippines with USTR Ms. Tai, has indicated small and medium enterprises, supply chains, clean energy are likely to be priorities for the Philippines. And the final question you asked was about BRI. I don't see the IPEF as directly contradictory or counter to BRI for two reasons. One, BRI investments by China in the Philippines have not been huge or substantial. In fact, they've been less than all the talk about the BRI. Second, the standards, rules, and norm building in the IPEF categories of the four pillars are far more substantial than pure infrastructure investment. So it's not a direct counter, but I think the big takeaway is we're back in the economic game. We're trying to craft a path forward since we're not in RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or in CPTPP, the large multilateral trading arrangement. So this gives us a pathway into the region, working with our allies and partners, including the Philippines. And that is to be welcomed, and it has been welcomed in Manila so far as well. So I'd leave it at that for now.
Great. Thank you, Satu. That was really interesting way to put it, that this does show that the U.S. is back economically in the region, but at the same time, it's not overly ambitious, and it builds on much economic activity that is already happening from the U.S. In the region. Well, Brian, next I'd like to turn to you and shift the discussion a little bit toward the politics in the Philippines. We just had this election, change in administration, but there were many reports about disinformation and misinformation surrounding the election campaign. Of course, the U.S. has its own issues on misinformation and disinformation. But to what extent do you think that this challenge is impacting the quality of democracy in the Philippines? And what can be done to get a handle on the problem? Is there anything the U.S. can assist with when it comes to the challenge of misinformation and disinformation, particularly in a country like the Philippines, where social media is such a part of the daily lives of the citizens?
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, it's a very tough question. It was certainly exciting for all of us to be in the Philippines in March and see some of the atmospherics around the election. It was a wild ride. I think, ultimately the fact that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. could win legitimately and overwhelmingly on the premise that he was going to restore some sort of golden age that was purported to exist under his father, really whitewashing the corruption, the human rights violations, really says a lot about the information environment in the Philippines. I mean, clearly there is a massive misinformation environment in the country. One of the highlights, I think, of perhaps you would agree, of our group's visit to the Philippines was a meeting at Rappler headquarters with Maria Ressa. She's literally written the book on this and has paid the price. She's called the Philippines a petri dish for actors like Cambridge Analytica to test algorithms. And you've had some very, the political families and parties very much willing to engage with this. In a lot of ways, the situation in the Philippines should be, as you alluded to, Lisa, very familiar to Americans. You have tens of millions of people living in completely different information environments, getting their news from completely different places, living in alternate realities in a lot of ways. And I think the major political movements in the Philippines over the last decade have really stoked this. The Dutertes, now the Marcoses. And it's corrosive. They are just like it is here at home. It's also much like here, Duterte and Marcos in this disinformation machine have tapped into some real resentments. Poverty alleviation is the economy and the economy for individual people is the top issue for most Filipinos. And there's a lot of reasons for Filipinos, tens of millions of Filipinos, to resent their leaders. So there's a very lucrative environment for this type of disinformation. And as an American, I think we should, we didn't talk much about this in the report, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, it's hard to say. We need to have some humility, as you say. Clearly what we need to do, though, if we can do anything, is supporting civil society and journalists, lifting up and making sure that civil society and journalism isn't completely crushed here, doing what we can. I'd leave it to the tech policy experts, but I mean, there's certainly a role for U.S. social media companies as it relates to global policy here and in the Philippines. But it's not just about, we can't just blame social media here. It's about norms. President-elect Marcos in his post-election press conference, picked and chose a handful of traditional media outlets, including some fringe ones, and didn't include others. So it's about norms on that front as well. But ultimately, Marcos won legitimately in the sense that he collected by far the most votes. Duterte is going out with sky-high approval ratings. Clearly, this isn't a distorted information environment. So it presents a real conundrum for us. There's no doubt about it.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you for putting that in perspective. I think it is an issue that hopefully the U.S. and the Philippines can continue to work together, find their way through. But as you say, Marcos Jr. elected legitimately, overwhelmingly, and just moving forward, the disinformation, misinformation issue is not going to go away. It's something that will need to be dealt with. But I want to turn back to China. So Patrick, I'm going to go back to you. Let's talk about China's hybrid warfare strategy, this non-military use of fishing vessels, the so-called Chinese maritime militia, fishing boats, using this to kind of assert their expansive maritime claims. For example, in May 2021, the Philippines EEZ was violated by about 287 Chinese vessels. How can the United States work with the Philippines and other bilateral partners in the region as well to address China's continued use of these so-called gray zone tactics?
Well, Lisa, it is a great challenge. Trying to deter aggression is one thing, but trying to deter these sort of calibrated actions that lead to coercion and unilaterally change the status quo without actually live fire is even a harder task. And that's what the United States has been working on with the Philippines, along with Japan and Australia and other Southeast Asian countries, in terms of building up maritime capacity to try to make sure that China's actions don't chip away at the sovereignty of these countries and the strategic autonomy and the independence. And that's the real challenge here. China seized Mischief Reef back in 1995, just 3 years after U.S. forces had left Subic and Clark. That was a sign. That's how China was going to do business. You're going to provide an opportunity, we're going to go in because nobody can stop us. In 2012, after a 12-week standoff or 10-week standoff around Scarborough Shoal, they commandeered control over Scarborough Shoal, which is in the EEZ, historic fishing grounds of the Philippines. And as a result, they still control Scarborough Shoal. They control the hydrocarbon marine surveys in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines that overlap with the 9-dash line. They control, they swarm around Thitu Island in the Spratlys. They harass these ships that you mentioned recently. It's a long list of what China's been doing with these gray zone operations, because they really do have three navies, the Navy, the Coast Guard, and this maritime militia, this civilian force that's been paramilitarized. And so China is going to have to face hopefully a stronger strategy as well as a bigger network of like-minded countries. And this is where the U.S. can continue to build on what we've been doing with the Philippines, right? So as the report calls for, upgrading the strategic dialogue with the 2+2, the defense and foreign Secretary of State Secretary of Defense, and their counterparts in the Philippines, who haven't been named yet as of this recording. And yet, those are going to be very critical ongoing discussions that we're going to need to have, because we need a strategy together. And the strategy is not about how do we counter China, it's how do we help the strategic autonomy in the rules-based system. That's the common ground here between Manila and Washington, where we can really help. The rules of the road are a big part of what we've been pushing. Just as Satu was talking about with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that's really kind of rules of the road for the digital economy in many ways. Well, we could come together with Indo-Pacific countries and put together a declaration on the code of conduct that they've been unable to finish in the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nation context, talking to China ever since Mischief Free, frankly. And we could also make sure that, yes, the Philippines should be encouraged to have risk reduction measures with China, just as we are seeking them out, but China doesn't respond very well. As the report calls for, asymmetric capabilities, building the maritime domain awareness is critical. So just as the Quad countries in Japan last month talked about building maritime domain awareness for the Pacific Island nations, those same capabilities, space-based fusion centers, connections, can help provide the kind of information that the Philippines will need in the West Philippine Sea, in the Philippine Rise and beyond, because that's where China is really continuing to press. And then work with like-minded countries. The report talks about the minilateral concept with Japan and Australia and the United States, but I think also just as important will be minilateral cooperation with Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. And I think all of these and many other sort of attributes that can be found in the report and beyond by the contributors to the task force that you put together. There's some great ideas out there for strengthening relations that help the Philippines have their strategic autonomy and the independent foreign policy that President-elect Marcos actually wants.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. I'm so glad you mentioned the Quad initiative, the Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative that was announced by the Quad, which I think could really be a game changer in terms of encouraging this cooperation, between countries in the Indian Ocean region, Southeast Asia, the Pacific island nations, bringing all of that information together in a cooperative effort, so that, as you say, they can each, establish their autonomy, their independence, but through cooperation with one another to get that comprehensive picture of what's happening in the seaways. So, Satu, I would like to turn to you and come back to economic related issues, specifically the energy issue, which is so important globally today, but in particular in the Philippines. So the task force recommended that the U.S. should share its knowledge and expertise regarding LNG production, and work to develop onshore LNG import facilities within the Philippines. How can the U.S. and the Philippines expand LNG production within the Philippines while maintaining climate commitments that were outlined in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework?
Right. Thanks, Lisa, for the question. Obviously, the energy relationship between the United States and the Philippines is a major element, not only on the environmental front, but on the economic front, commercial front. So this kind of brings a number of threads together. So I'm very pleased that the report dealt with this issue, and particularly the natural gas issue. Look, I would have said prior to Ukraine, perhaps some different things, but as you know, this is a global market. And so the Ukraine situation, with all the energy implications thereof, has also created a new environment for natural gas, which spills down into the U.S.-Philippine relationship. But I think there are 3 or 4 big things to understand, I think, in this space. One is that in the post-COVID recovery, Philippines economy will pick up. How fast, how much is a little unclear, but clearly it will pick up from the low points brought on by the pandemic, as it did for so many other countries in the world. So number one, energy demands are going to increase. Pick your estimate, but a recent report I read said almost 4 times the increase. The second thing is the obligations on the climate change front. And this is where IPEF, my earlier comment on IPEF comes in. There is a clean energy element of the IPEF. And so that will be important as Philippines looks to engage with that, sign on to that. I think there may be more opportunities. The third is the commercial sector. A recent report I read on the natural gas investments in the Philippines suggested, and I'm no expert on this, but the report I read suggested there were 6 projects, including one by an American company, to build natural gas facilities, LNG facilities in the Philippines. And my understanding is that there's a lot more space, which leads me to sort of my final point on this question and links to my earlier comments about IPEF in the context of the overall U.S.-Philippine commercial and economic relationship. All of these tools are important. Yes, we should encourage natural gas development as we move towards a longer-term shift towards renewable and clean energy, for sure. But it also has to come with the local regulatory, legal, and commercial environment that will attract private sector investment. And unless the U.S. government can deliver huge subsidies, which I don't see forthcoming, it will also have to be a demand side pull by the Philippines to attract American companies who have the technology, the capability to provide natural gas facilities and capabilities to the Philippines. So I think all of these go hand in hand, but it's a critical part of our relationship. And I would just point out, there already are a number of U.S.-Philippine government-led initiatives, such as the Energy Secure Philippines effort, the Energy Policy and Development Program, already going on between Manila and Washington. So I hope that the commercial sector can be brought into this more as we go down the road. So let me stop there, Lisa, and take any other questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Satu. I have one last question I want to ask of the panel, and then I'll turn to audience questions. So keep those questions coming in from the audience if you have them. So Brian, you've done a lot of work on the peace process in the Philippines, in the southern Philippines. We visited when we were in the Philippines, Marawi, where there was actually an ISIS uprising in 2017, 1,000 militants killed in that operation. A lot of destruction that we witnessed firsthand there. So, what should be the role of the U.S. in assisting the Philippines to ensure that peace is secured in the southern Philippines? But also, what do you think? How do you think the new government is going to approach the peace process in Mindanao?
Thanks, Lisa, and I appreciate how you frame it, and I'm glad we were able to highlight this issue in the report. I think people know that there's a counterterrorism challenge in the southern Philippines, but we rarely talk about the peace process, which is is something that's a really important topic that I just don't think gets the attention it deserves, and ultimately I think is a potentially an important area for U.S. Philippines cooperation, and certainly in the past 2 years as I've been at the U.S. Institute of Peace, something that I've been quite focused on. For those who aren't following, a 2014 peace agreement between the national government and the MILF that led to the creation of a Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. It's called the BARM, which was created in 2019, has really reduced violence in Mindanao and provided the greatest hope in living memory for a sustainable peace. It was very striking when we were on our trip to the Philippines in March, and we were speaking with some of the very top officials in the Duterte government. And you asked them to list out what the major accomplishments were for the last 6 years. The establishment of the BARM was just right up there in a top tier, alongside getting infrastructure development going, and then the drug war, which you take it as you will. And I think President Duterte really does deserve a lot of credit here. He expended political capital to push through a Bangsamoro organic law that created the BARM, and he also put in more political capital to extend a transition period for the interim government from 2022 to 2025 to take some of the pressure off of them. they face a lot of challenges, though. I mean, basically, the BTA ministers, the Bangsamoro transition ministers, are former guerrillas now trying to establish a parliamentary system, establish a government, decommission combatants, and there are plenty of ISIS-affiliated spoilers out there that hoping that they'll fail. You know, the Bangsamoro government and civil society needs a whole lot of everything. But one thing that's very important is a very good partner in Manila and a president who really believes in the whole enterprise. Marcos has said very good things about the peace process during the campaign and since the campaign, but he has a lot of baggage, martial law, and a real seminal massacre in Mindanao under his father. Create some distrust, although we should not judge him by his father. But as a result of that atmosphere, the MILF supported Lenny Robredo in the campaign. I think the most important reason, you need budget from Manila to be transferred down to the autonomous region and for that money to be used truly autonomously. But the bigger point is that during this transition phase, Manila basically appoints the ministers in charge of the BARM. And so whether Marcos is going to put in some people who, some mayors who supported him in the election, or put in the people who really are working to build peace in the region is critically important. I do think this is an area where the United States could be far more involved. It's something that we're working on at USIP. We're figuring out what exactly the issues are and the ways that we can support. At least from our part, we're thinking about certainly technical advisory support to the interim government. One thing very much in our DNA at USIP, there's a nascent Bangsamoro Peace Institute that we're looking to work with. I think there needs to be more opportunities for the Bangsamoro and national government officials to sit together and learn together and build a future. So we're on the case at USIP, but I think there's a lot more that the State Department could do. It's a winner. It's not political, and I hope to see more action in this. Certainly, leading up to 2025 when there'll finally be elections in the BARM.
Thanks, Brian. I don't think we hear enough about that important peace process. So thank you for providing that information. And, it is extremely important. And as we saw with the uprising in 2017, that we need this peace process to continue. And there are so many challenges there, and USIP is doing great work there. So congratulations on that. Okay, with that, I would like to turn to our audience for their questions. And I see that Joseph has asked, what are the prospects now for a return of the U.S. to its naval and air facilities in the Philippines? Okay, that's a very interesting question. I don't know, Patrick, do you want to take a stab at that, or anybody else?
I mean, Lisa, I'm happy to talk about it, but we should hear from you on this issue, including even channeling Ambassador Harris again, if you want, on this. From my perspective, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, is ready to move into the next phase. It's been able to move ahead despite the fact that we went through this very rocky political period with especially the first 4 years maybe of the Duterte relationship. It got better, it repaired itself toward the end when I think Duterte realized he needed a strong alliance to be a counterweight to China, because he wasn't going to get his way. And I think the fact that we now have the planning with the Visiting Forces Agreement sort of codified and agreed to, no longer being terminated or being held out every 6 months, there's a new opportunity for longer term planning on what we do with these. So Ambassador Harris mentioned the fact that we could have these joint operating positions that could be part of the next step of EDCA. I think that would be great. President-elect Marcos has just talked about moving the Navy, upgrading it back at Subic Bay for the Philippine Navy. I think we should be helping the Philippines with their Navy, with their Coast Guard. I note that Japan just delivered 2 nearly 100-meter long cutters last month. Very impressive. I've been on these Coast Guard cutters that Japan has. They use them in the Senkaku Island areas for patrols. These are going to be really valuable for the Philippines. So working with our other allies like Japan to help the Philippines can be crucial, as much as us going back in, if you will, to Subic and Clark. I don't see us going back in the way we were before we left, at the end of 91, when that was determined by the Senate of the Philippines. But at the same time, I do see this EDCA relationship going to the next level, and I see our cooperation with our allies helping the Philippines with their naval, air, and Coast Guard capabilities also increasing.
Okay, so I will take your advice and seek to channel a bit of Ambassador Harris' comments. He did send in some comments relating to this question. Basically, what Ambassador Harris says is we have to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to EDCA, of course, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. He said we have to do this with fiscal and intellectual vigor. Which I think says it all. The EDCA is extremely important. It's slowed to some degree, I think, over the last several years. Although I will say we visited Cesar Basta Air Base when we were in the Philippines in March, and we met with some of the U.S. forces who were there, and things were moving forward in terms of the EDCA agreement. So despite it may not be moving over the last couple of years as quickly as we would like, it is happening, and hopefully we'll see a renewed commitment from the Marcos Jr. administration, because I think it will be important, not only for U.S. access and facilities, but also to be able to expand the capabilities of the Philippines Armed Forces and their plans for the future and military modernization efforts. So it's a two-way street. It benefits both our countries. So I do hope that EDCA will move forward. Brian, Satu, anything to add? No? Okay. All right. Let's move on to our next question, which comes from Sebastian. Sebastian asks, to what degree will the Marcos Jr. administration be a continuation of the Duterte years? What do you see as the main threads that will continue? What do you expect will be the departures? Very, very good question. Satu, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to take the first crack at that?
Sure, I'll take the first crack. It's a great question because we're all sort of been through this phase of the last few years and wondering, whether this is a blip or a change. I'd flag 3 or 4 things that I see. Just sort of structurally in the U.S.-Philippines relationship, perhaps in the Philippines itself. One is this trend towards a kind of very populist and nationalist leader. This seems to me a continuity. Exactly all the social and economic and cultural elements of such nationalism and populism, I'm not entirely sure about any more than I am about my own country, the United States, about trends. But clearly there is a desire for strong leadership, for a very nationalist leadership, for a very populist. The second, I would say, is a real priority on development of infrastructure, on addressing economic concerns of the population. Whether that's fully done or not is a different question from that's driving some of the public outreach. That more seems to be more order in order to achieve these larger economic results. And the third, I would say, is I think we're going to have to get used to in the United States understanding that the Philippines is living in an environment and a geographic space and an international space which allows them multiple choices. I mean, Patrick made the terrific point about Japan's engagement with the Philippines. It's huge. Every time I go to the Philippines, I'm always surprised. We talk about China, but Japan has a significant commercial, economic, security role in the Philippines. Australia is an important player. India recently sold BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. My point is, this is a very multipolar and increasingly multipolar environment. And the final point I'd say is, I find it very hard between these two administrations to see a fundamental change in the fact that the Filipino public consistently, when polled, shows support for the U.S.-Philippine alliance. Even if there are differences about domestic policies or other issues, there's strong support for the alliance. There's strong support for the U.S.-Philippine relationship. And we haven't talked about it so far, but I just flag it. There are 4.5 million, roughly, Filipino Americans. As I said, there's a huge back and forth. There's a deep historical linkage. There's huge sister city and civil society linkages. I'm not suggesting these substitute for government relations or government policy, which are critical, but let's look at the totality of that relationship. And regardless of whether it's President Marcos or President Duterte, these fundamental structural ballasts in the relationship, people to people, history, relationships between our institutions and civil societies will keep a ballast in the relationship as they have over the last few years.
Please.
I mean, I'd agree. I think you're going to see much more continuity than change. This was not a change election. This was a continuity election. President Duterte is going out with 75, 80% approval ratings. Most Filipinos blame the information environment or not, but most Filipino think that the country is going in the right direction. Vote for President Marcos, and we haven't discussed it at all today, but Vice President Sara Duterte was the vote for continuity. So I think in general, you're going to see a continuation. Patrick mentioned that a very business-friendly economic team came in. Again, we can all have various opinions about President Duterte, but he had a very strong economic team that finally got infrastructure going. So I think you're going to see a continuity on this. I think politics, as it relates to China and the United States and public sentiment, provide guardrails for just how far you can drift towards China, and certainly the issues of the West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, fisheries. This is politically resonant. I think one of the areas that we should be watching and concerned, though, as it relates to China, is more on money in Manila and investment in things like the digital economy, telecommunications, the grid. Is there going to be more coziness between a Marcos presidency, big business, major Chinese interests? So I think that's the place to really watch.
Great, thank you. Let's go to our next question, which is from Renato. He asks, this is a fairly provocative one, so this should get interesting. What do you think will be the role of the Philippines as a U.S. ally in case of a major armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait? Patrick, do you want to try to take a stab at that? And
Sure, Lisa. I mean, the aim of a U.S. policy, not just in this administration, but previous ones, is to preserve stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait. So the Philippines plays a critical role just by being our ally. And the healthier that alliance, the stronger our ability to be present and to signal deterrence, that we'll be in a position to resupply Taiwan if necessary in a crisis or in a conflict. But the aim here is to avoid a conflict. And so we don't want the Philippines thinking that we want the Philippine alliance only because we're trying to get into a war with China over Taiwan. It's just the opposite. We're trying to uphold the rules-based system that is in the Philippines' interests, because otherwise, without those rules, they lose control over mining their own hydrocarbons in their EEZ, their own fishing. They're going to lose, as Brian suggested, potentially cyber sovereignty if they're not careful about the investments they allow into their power grid or into their telecommunication systems. So really, this is a relationship that is a reciprocal and mutual benefit about the rules and avoiding conflict. So I'm not going to go into the Taiwan scenarios because I think that's really takes us down the wrong path of where we want to go. U.S. does have a lot of military capability. We're going to continue to invest strong defense. We want strong allies, but we don't expect the Philippines to be fighting in a Taiwan scenario. What we do expect is that the Philippines to be fighting for peace and security, for their own sovereignty, and that in turn will empower the United States and other like-minded countries to preserve the peace and deterrence.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I have a similar related question, and it relates to something that's in the report. The Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines states that the two countries will defend one another against external armed attack. And the report recommends that the U.S. should consider any construction of permanent military or dual-use structures at the Scarborough Shoal by an adversary as unacceptable and a potential trigger for employing Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. If China were to move on Scarborough Shoal, what would a response from the United States look like? Or at least what should a response look like? And just to mention, again, I'll try to channel Ambassador Harris. He recommends that the U.S. be crystal clear to China that the U.S. takes its treaty obligations to the Philippines seriously and would view any takeover, construction, or reclamation at Scarborough Shoal as triggering the Mutual Defense Treaty. Do you agree with Ambassador Harris, Patrick, or anybody else that wants to comment?
I absolutely agree with Admiral Harris, Ambassador Harris, on this issue. And the reason this is important, the report calls for the 2+2, for instance, is because these kind of reassurance agreements don't just happen. You build trust over time. And so, having your Secretary of State and your Defense Secretary talking to your Philippine counterparts all the time is exactly how you build that reassurance. It was back in 2012, again, over Scarborough Shoal, when we didn't seem to be backing the Philippines when they were being shoved around. That was the impression left in the Philippines. And as a result, they felt like, well, they're going to have to essentially deal with China in a different way. So they dealt both through the diplomatic path of going to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, but then also by the time Duterte came to power, by trying to pivot to China and placate China. That neither one of these has stopped China. So we do need to be very clear about integrated deterrence, because I think China's plan is more like integrated denial. How can they deny the United States sort of access to the region? How can they deny any one neighbor from being able to align with others against their interests? And yet Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, these are Philippine interests on their continental shelf and their sort of exclusive economic zone. This is exactly where we want to help the Philippines. So we need to be clear that we will indeed be having their backs.
Yeah, I'd just add, Lisa, I think that's all right, and the 2+2 is important. But it's been interesting over the last few years, the focus on the Mutual Defense Treaty and the Visiting Forces Agreement. In a lot of ways, there have been some good outcomes. I think there are much more deliberate technical discussions happening between our two defense establishments than there have been for decades, and that needs to continue. And I think looking to the U.S.-Japan alliance for mechanisms, for guidelines for the alliance and alliance mechanisms, these sorts of things. That the alliance with Philippines in a lot of ways has just sort of been there on paper. It wasn't institutionalized in the way it should be. But this debate over the VFA and the MDT over the last few years has actually created a lot of energy. And my sense is there's far more connectivity between the defense policy establishments in a really healthy way. So that needs to sit underneath the 2+2 or the political. But I think we're actually in a good place on this now.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question. I'm going to take the liberty as being the moderator to pose the last question. But I want us to think a little bit more broadly about ASEAN. Of course, the Philippines is a major player in ASEAN, but one of the issues that Ambassador Harris raised in his written comments was that, we haven't had an ambassador to ASEAN since the Obama administration. I will note that on May 14th, the administration nominated Johannes Abraham, who's currently the White House Chief of Staff to the NSC, to be ambassador to ASEAN. So hopefully very soon we will indeed have a new U.S. ambassador to ASEAN. But maybe if each one of you could take just a minute or so to talk about the significance of ASEAN within sort of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, what the U.S. role should be in relationship to ASEAN, and where do you see ASEAN moving forward over the next 5 years or so? Maybe we could start with you, Satu.
Right. Well, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, my views on ASEAN are pretty clear. First of all, I think it's something that the regional countries want. They're all in different levels of dissatisfaction with its outcomes, not least on Myanmar, not least on South China Sea, not least on Rohingya issues, etc. But it is an institution of their making. The fact that President Biden had this special summit with the ASEAN leaders here last month, I think is very critical to show that it's not the only institution we privilege in the region, but it is an institution we pay attention to and work with in the region. Third, I would say that we have an opportunity. We have the Cambodia chairmanship this year. Next year, it's Indonesia, which is this year chairing the G20. That's very important. Indonesia is the largest economy in the region. It's transitioning and holding its democratic elections. So it's a really important time to be engaging over the next couple of years. And finally, I'd say, it's a long-term project in ASEAN. I'm always a little uncomfortable with ASEAN didn't do this, it didn't agree on that. There's plenty of suboptimal results from ASEAN, but it still remains a place where regional capitals and regional leaders get together. And barring that, it gives us some way to access the region as a whole and to engage the region as a whole, put initiatives out to the region as a whole. So while it may be imperfect, it can coexist with AUKUS and the Quad and with a number of variety of other arrangements, and gives us another tool in our toolkit to deal with the region. So I continue to support a pretty fulsome engagement. It's great news that we'll have an ambassador finally after several years. We'll have a new ambassador in Philippines soon, and a new ambassador hopefully in Jakarta assigned to ASEAN as well. So that's what I would end up by saying.
Indeed. Thank you, Satu, and thank you for all your hard work on ASEAN. Brian, Patrick, did you want to jump in? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Just
Okay,
again, ASEAN, if it were a bloc, it's going to be the fourth largest economy by the end of this decade. This is not a trivial sort of fact. Secondly, President Biden's hosting, the first ever White House hosting of the ASEAN leaders, paid off in dividends. Not only did he clearly listen to the Indonesians who helped prepare that meeting, but a Singapore prime minister who came 6 weeks earlier, but he was able to very quietly have 7 Southeast Asian nations sign on as launching the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in Tokyo, which was a major announcement that was unexpected. And that came about because of the good diplomacy of respecting ASEAN centrality, of talking to the leaders. And so this can really pay dividends for U.S. policy going forward. And by the way, we need to, because this is exactly where China is trying to control the area, control the rules, and dominate the space in a way that will hurt the interests of all of us.
well said. Thank you, Patrick. Brian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that Patrick and Satu had to say, but I'd just point out a bit of a paradox as it relates to U.S.-Philippines relations. I think sometimes internally within ASEAN, the Philippines is sort of seen to be a bit distant. Oh, they're part of the U.S. alliance network in Asia. They're sort of geographically a bit removed. But the irony is that with the turbulence in U.S.-Philippine relations, that there wasn't close U.S.-Philippines coordination on ASEAN-related matters. I think potentially there's an opportunity for Philippines to the U.S.-Philippine relationship to sort of play an important role there as it relates to the U.S. alliance network. If there's going to be increasing minilateralism, like we recommend in the report, U.S.-Japan, Philippines, U.S.-Philippines, Australia, and as it relates to ASEAN, and certainly the regional architecture is in flux with the rise of the Quad, and what does this mean for ASEAN centrality? And actually, I think the U.S.-Philippines alliance and a really just more intensive diplomacy between the two countries could actually help resolve some of those matters.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to all the panelists. This has been an excellent discussion. We now move to the closing remarks for this discussion today. Very pleased to have a very special guest, part of the U.S.-Philippines Alliance Task Force. We have with us to close us out Dr. Henry Howard. Dr. Howard is founder and director of the U.S. Philippines Society, as well as Philippine Honorary Consul for the state of Florida, and a highly successful businessman as the founder and 100% owner of the U.S. Education Finance Group. Dr. Howard has 46 years of experience on the Philippines, having first traveled to the country as a young high school exchange student to attend Xavier University High School in Mindanao in 1974. Ever since then, he has been a regular visitor to the country. He's been involved in the politics, economics, and culture of the country. He's facilitated U.S.-Philippines relations, people-to-people contacts, and he's engaged in numerous charity projects that have helped the Filipino people. And one of his most important contributions to building the U.S.-Philippines relationship was his involvement in coordinating, lobbying, financing, and ensuring the return of the 3 Balanginga bells to the Philippines. These were church bells that American soldiers had taken as spoils of war following the aftermath of the Battle for Balanginga in 1901. Through an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, Dr. Howard enabled the transfer of the original bells from U.S. military facilities in Wyoming and South Korea to the Catholic Church in Eastern Samar. He also helped provide an exact copy of one of the Balanginga bells to the U.S. Army in Fort Carson, Colorado, and memorial plaques to the F.E. Warren Air Force Base, as well as to the Wyoming Veterans Commission. So it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Henry Howard.
Thank you, Lisa. And can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, very good. I also would like to thank Lisa and the other members of the task force for their comments today. It was a great honor for me to be asked to join this task force and to help formulate the activities of the task force, as well as put together the trip to the Philippines in March of 2022. Our goal with this task force was to install in it individuals like Patrick and Satu and Brian that have had a long-term interest in the Philippines, a long-term presence and interaction with the Philippines. And in addition to those 3 gentlemen, we also had Captain Dennis Wright, who's been associated with the Philippines as long as I have, Colonel Dr. John Cinco, again, longer than I have, Rick Jacobson, formerly of the Central Intelligence Agency. Everybody knows that. It's an open secret. Again, as long as I have. So we made a big effort to not have armchair quarterbacks, as the American football fans would say, but to have real experts with a deep understanding of the Philippines take part in this task force. The move to strengthen ties with the Republic of the Philippines is part of a larger strategy or strategic shift in U.S. foreign policy to Asia. As Dr. Cronin pointed out, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is basically the number 4 economic region in the world. And it cannot be ignored, and the Philippines is a crucial and linchpin part of that. Philippines has a population of 110 million people. 10 million of those live abroad and send money home to their families. And the Philippines is crucial, and just as crucial, if not more crucial, than some of our other security partners we have in Asia, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Thailand. In terms of the foreign policy of the Philippines, I think given my 48 years of experience there, the Philippine political class, regardless of whether they support President Duterte, they support President-elect Marcos, they supported former President Aquino. Over the years, the Philippine political class, which run the country, want to balance it out between the United States and China. And I believe that everyone in the Philippines, that is anyone politically, believes a security and commercial relationship with the United States is desirous, and that a solely commercial relationship with China is desirous. Please note that it's a security and commercial relationship with the United States, and it's a commercial relationship with China that best serves the independence and continued independence of the Philippines. So whatever we do as Americans and as the United States government toward the Philippines, we need to keep in mind that there's always going to be a commercial relationship with China, and that we, the United States, cannot just solely focus on a security relationship. One day I sat down and I counted 140 different interfaces on a daily basis between the United States and the Philippines, and only about 10 of those were government to government. 130 of them were business to business, or people to people, or sister city to sister city, as some others mentioned earlier. But in terms of the security relationship, I would like to compare and contrast the circumstances surrounding the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 versus the circumstances surrounding the Visiting Forces Agreement of 1998 and the EDCA Agreement of 2014. The Philippines, more than anything else, wants a secure security relationship with the United States that it can count on, as opposed to a nebulous one. And they also want security treaties with the United States that are long-lasting and sacrosanct. And let me give you an example of the Mutual Defense Treaty versus the other two treaties. The Mutual Defense Treaty was signed on August 30th, 1951, and it was ratified by the United States Senate on March 20th, 1952, and that treaty was signed by the United States President on April 15th, 1952. And then there were formal instruments of ratification exchanged between the two sovereign countries, the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America, on August 27th, 1952, which brought the Mutual Defense Treaty into full force and effect. Back in 2011, there was a further strengthening of the Mutual Defense Treaty by virtue of the 2011 Manila Declaration, when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and then Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario met in Manila and issued a statement reaffirming the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Mutual Defense Treaty did have some very nebulous clauses in it, which makes the Philippine political class nervous. And as Patrick Cronin pointed out, the Scarborough Shoal incident made the Philippine political class question the validity of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And that resulted in political opportunities for some in the Philippines. Now, I want to compare the Mutual Defense Treaty to the VFA. The VFA was signed in 1998 by the then U.S. Ambassador, my friend Thomas Hubbard. And I don't know who signed it on the other side for the Philippines. I'll have to go back and check my history book on that one. The EDCA agreement was signed in 2014 by ex-U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines and ex-Aquino Secretary of National Defense, Yasmin. So on its face, you can see that the VFA and the EDCA are agreements that were undertaken at much lower levels than the Mutual Defense Treaty. And I think if we're going to be the trusted ally of the Philippines, and we want the Philippines to continue to be our ally into the foreseeable future, we need to have these VFA and EDCA agreements formalized at a much higher level as the Mutual Defense Treaty was when it was incepted back in 1951 and 1952. In addition to that, I have a couple of other comments that we weren't able to cover in the presentation today. In order to have goodwill between the Philippine political class and, i.e., the individuals who run the country, we need to have an effective visa policy. It's very hard to ask senators in the Philippines to vote for security agreements with the United States when half of the Senate cannot get a U.S. visa or has had their visa suspended or gets an appointment 2 years from now for a visa interview. So I'd like to just call the attention to everyone that in order to have an effective relationship between the United States and the Philippines, the members of the political class need access to the United States. It's very, very important. The more people from the Philippine government and the civil society and the business community that interface with the United States, the better. The more that come to Washington and meet with CNAS and CSIS, the better. I'll give you an example. Brian Harding is doing a great job interfacing with the Bangsa Moro autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, but its Prime Minister Murad, the former head of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, couldn't get a visa to come to the United States. If we're going to strengthen the BARM, I think we ought to be hosting Mr. Murad here in the United States as much as we can. With that in mind, there's a couple of other little things I wanted to mention. The Philippines wants to transition into F-16. Philippine Air Force wants to transition into F-16s. They want to buy 6 used F-16 two-seat trainers from Greece. The U.S. Department of Defense has not provided the permission for them to do that. They want to be able to train their pilots before a squadron of F-16s arrives for them to utilize. In terms of energy, there was recently an American-run company called AG&P that partnered with San Miguel Corporation to set up a liquefied natural gas import terminal near Manila. And we hope that the liquefied natural gas that is imported to the Philippines, comes from the United States or one of the United States security partners. In terms of misinformation and disinformation, I respectfully submit when someone gets 60 or 61% of the votes, i.e. 30 and 31 million votes, that 60 and 61% of the voting population of the Philippines, cannot be fooled by misinformation and disinformation, circulating around. Even though the Philippines is Facebooked up to its neck, everyone has a Facebook. surveys show that most people still get their political news from the television stations in the Philippines. With that in mind, I would like to thank all of the task force members of the Center for New American Security, especially Lisa Curtis and Joshua Fitt, as well as Richard Fontaine, the director, and all of the members of the task force for setting aside a significant amount of time on a pro bono basis to review the relationship with the Philippines and to contribute to this report. I also want to mention that this is the first time in my memory that a Washington-based think tank went on a listening tour of the Philippines before they produced a report. So the report that we are producing is highly reflective of the views of individuals in the Philippines from all political and socioeconomic azimuths. So with that, I would like to also thank all of the individuals in the Philippines with whom we met in March, and I hope they're listening in. And daghan salamat po. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. And thanks again to our three panelists. Thank you to the audience for tuning in today. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, as the case may be. Thank you.